It is a little after 1:30 in the morning. Inside a farmhouse on the edge of a quiet Cambridgeshire village, a phone begins to dial 3 numbers. A voice answers.
Motorway service?
Yeah, ambulance, please.
Ambulance, thank you.
Ambulance emergency, is the patient breathing?
I'm not sure. I don't know, I've just come upstairs now. My wife's placed down on the bed, so I'm going to flip her over now. But she never sleeps on her front. She's not moving at all. I'm calling her. Sian.
Okay. I need you to look at her very carefully and tell me if she's breathing.
No, she's not.
She's not breathing, okay.
And she dropped. Oh my God.
A man's voice, calm, almost too calm. He says he has just found his wife lying face down on the bed. She is not moving. He calls her name once, then follows the instructions he is given, though something about the way he follows them does not sit right. Somewhere in that house, a woman who had spent the weekend laughing with her husband, who had completed a 10-kilometer run only weeks earlier, who had climbed a mountain for the sheer joy of it, is already gone. And the man on the phone already knows it. Nobody outside that house suspects a thing. This is the case of Robert Hammond and Sian Hammond. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Sian Hammond was 46 years old, and by every account from the people who knew her, she was someone who made rooms feel warmer. Friends who had known her for 15 years described her as kind, bubbly, and endlessly friendly, the sort of person who remembered small details about your life and asked after them the next time she saw you. She had a wide circle of friends across the village of Histon, near Cambridge, built up over years of school runs, shared coffees, and family gatherings. She was a mother of 2 daughters, both teenagers by 2023, and those who watched her with them said devotion barely covered it. She showed up. She supported their sporting achievements, drove them to events, and was, in the words of one friend, extremely proud of who they were becoming. Sian had also thrown herself into fitness in recent years. She had taken up running, completed a 10-kilometer event she had trained hard for, and even climbed Ben Nevis, Britain's highest mountain, purely for the challenge of it. To the people around her, she seemed to be entering a period of her life defined by health, achievement, and quiet contentment. She ran a business alongside her family life, and was, by the account of investigators who later studied her case closely, an active and successful businesswoman in her own right. On the outside, the Hammond household looked like a success story. They had recently bought a second property, a holiday home, the kind of purchase that suggests a family that has made it. Friends who spoke about her later remembered small, ordinary moments rather than anything dramatic, which is often how the people we love best are actually remembered. One friend recalled that only weeks before her death, Sian had talked with real pride about completing her 10-kilometer run and about how she had pushed herself further than she expected on the climb up Ben Nevis. These were not the plans of a woman who felt her life was in any kind of danger. They were the plans of someone building a healthier, fuller version of the years ahead of her. That same friend would later describe an ordinary visit to the Hammond household, in the days immediately after Sian's death, when James described the two of them going to bed together as normal that final night, sharing what he called a cwtch, a Welsh word for a cuddle, before falling asleep. It was an intimate, almost tender detail offered by a husband who, at that point, was still being treated as a grieving widower rather than a suspect. What Sian did not know, in the final months of her life, was how far the comfortable picture around her had drifted from the truth. Robert James Hammond, known locally as James, was 47 years old and ran his own business, Hammond Mortgage Services. On paper, it was exactly the kind of profession that inspires trust. He spent his working life advising other people on debt, on repayments, on how to keep their finances in order. He was, by his own admission later in court, a confident and articulate man. Even the judge who eventually sentenced him would describe him as a habitual and accomplished liar, someone who could construct a convincing story whenever it suited him. To Sian and to the wider world, James was a husband and father who had built a comfortable, even enviable, family life. He and Sian had 2 daughters together. He supported their sport. He helped host family gatherings. Neighbors and friends who crossed paths with the couple had no reason to suspect the marriage was anything other than settled. But underneath that surface, cracks had begun to form long before anyone else could see them. James was carrying secrets that he had deliberately kept from his wife, secrets about money, about debt, and about how close their comfortable life actually was to collapsing. Sian, according to the judge who later reviewed the case, was completely unaware of the trouble the couple were in. Whatever pressure James was under, he made absolutely sure she never saw it. James was known for being sociable and confident, comfortable holding a room, comfortable reassuring a client or a friend that everything was under control. That same confidence, prosecutors would later argue, was exactly what allowed him to manage so many people, creditors, friends, even his own wife, without any of them comparing notes and noticing the story did not add up. That gap between the husband Sian believed she had and the man who was quietly unraveling beside her is where this story truly begins. By the autumn of 2023, James Hammond was facing what prosecutors would later call a surging mountain of debt, more than £300,000 of it. Money owed to HM Revenue and Customs, money owed to a financial company chasing repayment. And for months, instead of confronting it, he had been managing it the only way he knew how, by lying. He told creditors he had cancer. He told them he was going through a divorce. He told them he had suffered a breakdown, that he had relapsed, that his wife was seriously unwell and in hospital. None of it was true. Each excuse bought him a little more time, a little more breathing room, while the debt kept climbing underneath him. Then came a decision that, in hindsight, investigators would treat as one of the most telling details in the entire case. In the days leading up to Sian's death, James brought her life insurance policy back up to date, clearing arrears that had built up on it. That policy, once active again, was worth £450,000. Around the same time, he had also been looking into other things online, including researching what quantity of a common sedative medication would be dangerous if taken in excess. Prosecutors would later suggest this research connected to a specific detail. Sian was afraid of flying and was expected to take that same medication before a trip the family had planned. What made these lies so effective was that James did not tell just one of them. He layered several different excuses across different creditors and different months. so that no single person chasing him ever heard the same story twice, and no single lie had to hold up for very long before he replaced it with another. A cancer diagnosis brought him sympathy and a pause in contact. A supposed divorce explained away sudden changes to his financial arrangements. A claimed breakdown and relapse explained his unavailability. Each excuse was designed to close down a conversation rather than resolve it, and each one worked for just long enough. None of this was visible to Sian. She spent that final weekend the way she had spent countless weekends before, at home with her husband, going about ordinary family life. She had no idea that the man beside her had spent months building an elaborate structure of lies to keep his financial collapse hidden from everyone, including her, and that the walls of that structure were closing in. On the night of 29 October 2023, James and Sian Hammond spent the evening together at home in Prime's Corner, Histon. Nothing about the household's home security footage from that night suggested anything unusual. No one else entered the property. No one else left it. Whatever happened next happened between the two of them, inside their own home. At 01:50 in the early hours of 30 October, James dialed 999. He told the call handler he had found Sian face down on the bed and unresponsive. He said he had last seen her alive and well roughly half an hour earlier. On the recording of that call, later released by police, he can be heard saying that she never slept on her front, that she was not moving at all, that he had been calling her name repeatedly. The call handler talked him through CPR. He followed the instructions. But when paramedics arrived and one of them, a critical care paramedic, began assessing Sian, something did not add up. During attempts at resuscitation, blood came up through a tube inserted into her mouth, a detail that would later raise questions in court about the true state of her body when help arrived. A paramedic who examined the scene would ultimately form the professional view that CPR had not, in fact, been carried out before they got there. Sian Hammond was pronounced dead. In the hours and days that followed, James told friends and family that she had passed away in her sleep. He sent a message to a close friend's husband that same afternoon, saying simply that Sian had passed away the night before, and that it had been a tough day. He appeared, to everyone around him, to be a grieving husband processing a sudden, tragic loss. For a short time, that was exactly how the case was treated. A coroner's post-mortem examination took place on 3 November. It identified injuries that investigators described as concerning. A second, more detailed forensic post-mortem the following week reached a firmer conclusion. The cause of death was compression of the neck. In plain terms, Sian Hammond had been strangled. In the days between Sian's death and his arrest, James maintained close contact with the couple's wider circle of friends, several of whom visited him at the house to offer their condolences. During one of those visits, he described the final evening he had shared with Sian in warm, ordinary terms, an evening that, to anyone listening, sounded like any other night in a settled marriage. It was only in hindsight, once the forensic findings came back, that those same conversations would be re-examined by investigators as part of the timeline they were building. James Hammond was arrested on 10 November 2023. He would go on to plead not guilty at a hearing in December that year and consistently deny any wrongdoing right through to the moment the jury delivered its verdict, more than 8 months later. This case is a useful example of how forensic pathology, rather than any single witness, is often what turns a sudden death into a confirmed homicide. Initially, Sian's death did not raise alarm. She had no history of violence in her home, no prior police involvement, and her husband's account of finding her unresponsive was, on its face, plausible. It was only through a structured two-stage post-mortem process that investigators moved from concern to certainty. The first post-mortem flagged injuries that did not sit comfortably with a natural or accidental death. The second, a full forensic examination, established compression of the neck as the actual cause of death, a finding consistent with strangulation rather than any medical event. Alongside that medical evidence, investigators leaned heavily on the home's own CCTV system. This is a detail that comes up again and again in modern true crime cases. In an era where most family homes have some form of security recording, the absence of a third party can be almost as significant as the presence of one. The footage from that night confirmed no one else came or went from the property, which effectively removed any outside suspect from consideration and focused the investigation entirely on the two people who had been inside. Then there was the digital trail. Search history recovered during the investigation showed James had been looking into the lethal thresholds of a sedative medication in the period before Sian's death, research that prosecutors linked to her known fear of flying and an upcoming trip. Digital evidence like this, browser history, timestamps, search terms, has become one of the most powerful tools in modern prosecutions because, unlike memory or testimony, it does not shift or soften over time. Finally, the timing of the life insurance policy update stood out as financial evidence with almost forensic weight of its own. An insurance record showing a lapsed policy brought current days before a policyholder's death does not, by itself, prove intent, but combined with the surging debt, the pattern of lies to creditors, and the pathology findings, it became one more piece, locking the picture into place. There was also the paramedic testimony itself, which deserves attention as a category of evidence in its own right. Emergency responders are trained to recognize the physical signs of resuscitation attempts, the position of a body, the state of the airway, the timing of interventions. When a critical care paramedic formed the professional opinion that CPR had not actually been performed before their arrival, despite what had been described on the 999 call, that observation became a quiet but significant thread in the wider case, one that connected the performance on the phone to the physical reality investigators later established in the bedroom. Taken together, none of these individual pieces of evidence, the pathology, the CCTV, the search history, the insurance timing, the paramedic's account, would have been enough on its own. It was the way they interlocked, each one closing off an alternative explanation that turned a case which began as a private, sudden death into a fully reconstructed timeline of a homicide. It is worth saying clearly at the outset, nothing here is a clinical diagnosis. This is an analysis based on the evidence presented in court and the judge's own remarks at sentencing, not a professional psychological assessment of James Hammond as an individual. What the case does illustrate is a particular and disturbing psychological pattern sometimes seen in financially motivated domestic homicides: the gap between private collapse and public performance. For months, James Hammond maintained two entirely separate realities. In one, he was a struggling man drowning in debt, inventing illness, inventing separation, inventing crisis after crisis, simply to buy time with creditors. In the other, visible to his wife, his children, and his friends, he was a stable, successful mortgage broker living an enviable family life. Holding both of those realities together for as long as he did required what the judge later called a habitual and accomplished capacity for deception. That is not simply lying under pressure in a single moment. It is the sustained, methodical construction of a false narrative, repeated to different audiences over an extended period without it ever visibly cracking to the people closest to him. The judge who sentenced Hammond offered a phrase that has stayed with a lot of people who followed this case, that the killing was premeditated but not pre-planned. That is a subtle but important distinction. It suggests a mind that had, at some point, arrived at murder as an acceptable solution to his financial crisis, without necessarily working out the precise mechanics of how or when it would happen. The research into medication dosages suggests some degree of forward thinking, but the killing itself, by strangulation in their shared bedroom, has the character of something that happened when the pressure finally became unbearable, rather than a meticulously staged plan. What followed the killing is, in some ways, just as revealing: the calm 999 call. The instructions followed just enough to sound convincing, the message to friends framing Sian's death as peaceful in her sleep, the visits with grieving relatives where he spoke about their final evening together in warm and unremarkable terms, the days spent, in the judge's words, playing the part of a grieving husband. That is not panic, that is control, maintained under extraordinary pressure by someone who had spent months practicing exactly that skill on his creditors. It is also worth noting how defense counsel approached this in mitigation at sentencing, arguing there was not a significant degree of pre-planning involved. That argument, alongside the family's own plea for a minimum sentence, points to a tension that often exists in these cases between two competing readings of the same behavior. Is sustained, practiced deception evidence of a calculating mind capable of anything, or is it simply what financial desperation looks like when a person is not otherwise inclined toward violence? The court's eventual answer, guilty of murder with a substantial minimum term, suggests the jury and the judge placed real weight on the former. Here is the detail from this case that tends to generate the most discussion, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. James Hammond did not kill his wife in a moment of jealous rage, nor after any history of reported violence between them. He killed her, according to the case built by prosecutors, so that a £450,000 life insurance policy would pay out and clear a debt he had spent months hiding from her. In other words, this was not a crime of passion. It was, on the evidence, a crime of financial desperation dressed up in a marriage that looked, from the outside, entirely healthy. That raises an uncomfortable question that goes beyond this one case. How many marriages carry a version of this same hidden pressure right now, without it ever reaching this outcome? Financial secrecy within a relationship, one partner concealing debt, lying about their circumstances, controlling what the other partner knows about the household's true position, is increasingly recognized as a form of coercive and controlling behavior in its own right. It rarely ends the way this case did, but the underlying dynamic, one partner constructing an entire false financial reality to protect their own standing, is far more common than most people assume. There is also the matter of the sentence itself. A minimum term of 24 years for a murder the judge himself described as brutal and determined, has, in public discussion of this case, been debated as either appropriate or, in the view of some, too lenient given the calculated financial motive behind it. Sentencing guidelines in England and Wales weigh factors like the degree of pre-planning, and the judge's own finding that this was premeditated but not pre-planned sits at the center of that debate. Where you land on that question likely depends on how much weight you place on the outcome. A woman is dead for money versus the specific legal distinction between a long simmering plan and a decision made under sudden mounting pressure. Either way, this case sits at an uncomfortable intersection of two things people rarely put together: domestic homicide and financial concealment as its underlying motive. At the sentencing, Sian Hammond's 2 teenage daughters sat in the front row of the public gallery, supported by other family members. They could not fully see their father through the frosted glass of the dock, but in the moments they were able to stand, he placed his hand over his heart, and they smiled back and blew him kisses before leaving the court as he was taken away to begin his sentence. It is a small human detail in a case built almost entirely on financial records, forensic reports, and phone data. And it is worth remembering that underneath all of that evidence was a woman who climbed a mountain for fun, who ran 10 kilometers because she wanted to, who was, by every account, one of the friendliest people anyone had the pleasure of meeting. She was a wife, a mother, and a friend to many, and she was denied many more years of the fulfilling life she had clearly been building for herself. If you want to understand how investigators build a case like this, out of nothing more than a phone call, a search history, and a pathologist's report, piece by piece, until the true picture becomes impossible to deny, that is exactly the kind of case breakdown you will find on this channel every single day. If that is something you are into, hit subscribe. It is free, and it means a lot. Thank you for watching.